For a long time, you believed something inside you was broken, not suddenly, not because someone told you directly, but because of the quiet way your life began to feel. Distant, muted, unfamiliar. You noticed you couldn't feel things the way you used to. Moments that should have mattered didn't reach you. Moments that should have hurt barely touched you. And you didn't know how to explain it, so you explained it the only way you could. You blamed yourself. You told yourself you became weak, that somewhere along the way, you lost something essential, something other people seemed to keep. You watched them react, laugh, care, break, recover, and you wondered why you couldn't do the same. Why everything inside you felt held back, restricted, as if something was quietly preventing you from fully arriving inside your own life. And the most dangerous part wasn't the numbness. It was the meaning you gave to it. Because you didn't just feel different. You felt responsible. Responsible for your distance. Responsible for your absence. Responsible for becoming someone you no longer recognized. So you carried it silently. You carried the quiet shame of believing you were the reason you disappeared. But there is something you were never told. Something that changes everything once you see it. You did not become this way because you failed. You became this way because you adapted. And adaptation is not weakness, it's survival. If you adapted, then the question changes. Because this was never about what's wrong with you. It becomes about what happened to you. And that question is harder to face. Because most of your life, you were taught to look inward for the problem, to examine yourself, to correct yourself, to improve yourself. You became someone who takes responsibility, someone self-aware, someone who tries to grow. And that sounds like strength, but it also creates a quiet vulnerability. Because when something starts to feel wrong, you don't question the environment first. You question yourself. You assume the distance is your fault. You assume the numbness is your failure. You assume you were the one who changed. But what if you didn't? What if the change was never a collapse, but a response? A response to experiences where being fully yourself came with consequences. Consequences you may not even remember clearly. Moments where your honesty created tension. Moments where your emotion created discomfort. Moments where your openness was not fully received. And even if no one said it directly, your nervous system understood. It learned what was safe and what was not. It learned which parts of you could remain visible and which parts needed to be contained. Not because those parts were wrong, but because those parts were vulnerable. And vulnerability, without safety, always learns to hide. So the numbness didn't appear to hurt you. It appeared to protect you. And if it was protecting you, then something inside you was never trying to destroy you. It was trying to help you survive. Survival does not always look dramatic. It doesn't always look like escape or resistance. Sometimes survival looks like silence. It looks like restraint. It looks like becoming the version of yourself. That creates the least friction, because friction is dangerous. Not always physically, but emotionally, relationally, existentially. Friction threatens belonging. And belonging is something your nervous system is designed to protect at all costs, even if the cost is you, not all at once, not in ways you could easily see, but in quiet negotiations, moments where you learn to override your natural reactions, moments where you swallowed words before they reached your mouth, moments where you softened emotions before they reached your face, moments where you told yourself, it doesn't matter, even when it did. And each time, it felt like a small adjustment, a reasonable compromise, a necessary decision. But your nervous system was paying attention, recording everything, learning from everything. It noticed which version of you preserved connection and which version risked losing it. So it began guiding you, not toward aliveness, but toward safety, because safety ensures continuation. Safety ensures survival, and survival became the priority, even if you never consciously chose it. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. Because when you look at yourself now, you see the distance, you see the numbness, you see the absence, and you assume you created it. You assume you failed to remain strong enough, open enough, alive enough. But that assumption is built on incomplete information, because distance was not a collapse. It was a construction, built slowly, carefully, intelligently, by a system designed to protect you, not harm you. You did not wake up one day and decide to abandon yourself. Your nervous system made adjustments based on evidence that being fully present was not always safe, Evidence that being fully expressed was not always welcome. Evidence that being fully alive created risk, and risk threatened stability. So your system reduced the risk by reducing access to intensity, access to vulnerability, access to truth, not to erase you, but to preserve you, because preservation is survival, and survival is an act of loyalty, not betrayal. But you were never told that. No one explained that numbness is not the absence of strength, it is the presence of protection. Protection that became so effective. You began to believe it was your identity. You began to believe, this is just who I am now. Calm, detached, unaffected, independent, low maintenance. And those labels made sense because they matched your experience. But they did not explain your origin. They did not explain how you became this way. They did not explain why something inside you still feels missing. Because protection does not eliminate what it protects. It conceals it. It contains it. It places distance between you. And the parts of you that once existed freely and distance creates illusion. The illusion that those parts disappeared. But disappearance is not the same as inaccessibility. You did not lose yourself. You lost access. And loss of access is reversible. Not instantly, not effortlessly, but fundamentally. Because what was never destroyed does not need to be rebuilt. It needs to be rediscovered. And rediscovery begins with one realization. A realization that challenges everything you believed about yourself. You were never the problem. You were the solution. The solution your nervous system created to navigate environments, expectations, and experiences that required adaptation. You became who you needed to be in order to remain here, and that version of you deserves understanding, not blame, because blame assumes failure. And there was no failure. There was only survival. Survival that was never meant to define you forever, only to protect you until protection was no longer necessary. And the moment you begin to see that, something inside you shifts, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Enough to question the story, enough to loosen the shame, enough to consider that you were never broken, only protecting yourself. If you were protecting yourself, then the shame you carried was never meant to belong to you. But shame is persistent, because shame doesn't come from logic. It comes from interpretation, from the meaning you gave to your own adaptation. You didn't call it protection. You called it weakness. You didn't call it survival. You called it disconnection. You didn't call it intelligence. You called it failure, because no one ever taught you that losing access to yourself can be a form of self-preservation. So you created your own explanation, an explanation where you were at fault. Because blaming yourself feels like control. It creates the illusion that if you cause this, you can fix it, that if you were the problem, you can become the solution. But there is a hidden cost to that belief. Because when you believe you are the problem, you also believe you cannot trust yourself. You begin questioning your emotions, doubting your reactions, suppressing your instincts. You stop seeing yourself as someone worth listening to and start seeing yourself as someone who must be corrected, managed, improved, fixed. You become a project instead of a person. And living as a project is exhausting because projects are never finished. They are always one step away from being acceptable, always one improvement away from being enough, always one corrections away from being worthy. And that creates a life where you are never fully at rest inside yourself. Because rest requires trust. Trust requires safety. And safety cannot exist where self-blame is present. So even in moments where nothing is wrong, you feel uneasy because you are waiting for yourself to fail again, waiting for confirmation that something inside you is still broken. And this constant internal observation creates distance between you and your natural state. You stop moving freely. You move carefully. You stop expressing spontaneously. You express strategically. You stop being and start managing, because management reduces risk, but it also reduces aliveness. You cannot feel fully alive while monitoring yourself, because aliveness requires immersion, not supervision. Aliveness requires participation, not correction. But self-blame makes participation feel dangerous, because participation exposes you. It makes you visible. It makes you vulnerable. And vulnerability is what your nervous system learned to avoid. Not because vulnerability is weakness, but because vulnerability without safety creates pain. So your system did something intelligent. It reduced vulnerability by reducing access to emotional depth, access to emotional intensity, access to emotional truth. And this reduction created numbness. Not as punishment, but as protection. Protection from experiences that once overwhelmed you, protection from situations where being fully yourself felt unsafe. But you didn't see it that way. You saw the numbness and assumed it was evidence of your own inadequacy. You assumed. You failed to remain strong. You failed to remain open. You failed to remain alive. And that belief quietly shaped your identity. You began to see yourself as someone who lost something, someone who could not maintain what others seemed to keep, someone who became less emotional, less connected, less real. And that identity became heavy because it carried blame. And blame is not neutral. Blame is corrosive. It erodes trust. It erodes compassion. It erodes understanding, especially when the blame is directed inward. Because when you blame yourself, you turn yourself into the source of your own suffering. And when you are the source, you are also the enemy. You live in quiet opposition to yourself. You try to outrun your own reactions. You try to suppress your own feelings. You try to escape your own experience. And escaping yourself creates fragmentation. You split into two roles, the one being experienced and the one doing the judging, the one feeling and the one criticizing, the one existing and the one observing. And this division creates exhaustion because you are never fully whole. You are always divided, always partially present, always partially withheld. And over time, this division becomes normal. You forget what it feels like to exist without judgment, to feel without analysis, to react without correction, because self-blame has convinced you that your natural state cannot be trusted, that your instincts cannot be trusted, that your emotions cannot be trusted, that you cannot be trusted. And that belief is heavier than numbness itself, because numbness protects you, but self-blame attacks you. Numbness creates distance, but self-blame creates conflict. Conflict between you and yourself. And this conflict is what keeps you trapped. Not the numbness, but the belief that you caused it. Because as long as you believe you caused it, you will keep trying to fix yourself. Instead of understanding yourself, you will keep trying to change who you are. Instead of seeing why you adapted, you will keep trying to eliminate symptoms instead of recognizing their purpose. And purpose changes everything. Because symptoms without purpose feel like dysfunction, but symptoms with purpose reveal intelligence. They reveal adaptation. They reveal survival. And survival was never something to be ashamed of. It was something to be respected, because survival is evidence that something inside you refused to let you disappear completely. Self-blame feels responsible. It feels mature. It makes you believe you are being honest with yourself. But self-blame is often just misunderstood protection. Because blaming yourself creates a story that makes the pain make sense. If it was your fault, then at least there is an explanation. If it was your fault, then at least there is control. If it was your fault, then at least the world remains predictable. But there is a hidden violence in that belief. Because every time you blame yourself for adapting, you punish the very part of you that was trying to survive. You turn your protection into your enemy. You turn your intelligence into your shame. You turn your survival into your failure. And that creates a wound that never fully closes. Not because something is wrong with you, but because you have been standing against yourself. Most people never realize how early this begins. You learn to blame yourself in small moments. Moments where you were misunderstood. Moments where your emotions were inconvenient. Moments where your needs were too much for the people around you. You didn't conclude that the environment was limited. You concluded that you were. You didn't conclude that the situation was unsafe. You concluded that you were too sensitive. You didn't conclude that your reaction made sense. You concluded that something was wrong with you. So you adjusted, not because you were weak, but because you were aware. Aware of consequences, aware of rejection, aware of instability. Awareness forced adaptation. Adaptation created distance. Distance created numbness. And numbness became the evidence you used against yourself. This is the tragic loop of self-blame. The very thing that protected you became the thing you judged. But there is something important you need to see now. You did not choose this consciously. You did not sit down one day and decide to abandon yourself. Your nervous system made decisions faster than your mind could understand. It chose continuity. It chose connection. It chose survival. And survival always prioritizes keeping you here. Even if here feels empty sometimes. Even if here feels disconnected. Even if here feels like a version of you that you barely recognize. Because survival does not measure fulfillment. It measures persistence. And you persisted. You are still here. That alone is evidence of something inside you that refused to disappear completely. Something inside you stayed. Something inside you watched. Something inside you waited. Not for rescue, but for recognition. Recognition that you were never the enemy. Recognition that you were never the failure. Recognition that you were never the problem. Because the moment you stop blaming yourself, something unexpected begins to happen. You stop fighting yourself. You stop monitoring every reaction. You stop questioning every emotion. You stop assuming your distance is a personal defect. And in that space, your nervous system begins to soften, not because you forced it, but because it no longer needs to defend against you. Self-blame keeps your system in a state of internal threat. It convinces your body that you are unsafe to yourself, that your emotions are dangerous, that your instincts are unreliable. But when blame begins to dissolve, safety begins to return. Not external safety, internal safety. The kind of safety that allows you to exist without constant correction. The kind of safety that allows you to feel without immediate suppression. The kind of safety that allows you to be present without fear of becoming too much. And presence is where aliveness begins to reappear. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small moments. Moments where something feels real again. Moments where you notice your own reaction without judging it. Moments where you feel connected to something simple. These moments may feel unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable, because numbness was predictable. Numbness was controlled. Aliveness is not controlled. Aliveness moves. Aliveness changes. Aliveness exposes. But aliveness is also where you exist most truthfully. And the part of you that adapted, the part of you that went quiet, the part of you that protected you, was never trying to erase that aliveness. It was trying to preserve it. Preserve it until it was safe to feel again. And safety does not begin with changing your life. Safety begins with changing your relationship to yourself. It begins with removing the blame you were never meant to carry. It begins with seeing your numbness not as a defect, but as a decision your nervous system made to protect something valuable, something that still exists, something that was never destroyed, only hidden, waiting for the moment you stopped standing against yourself. There is a moment in every person's life when the story they believed about themselves begins to crack. Not because something outside changes, but because something inside becomes impossible to ignore. You begin to see your past differently, not as a list of your failures, but as a series of adaptations. You begin to see that the distance you feel today did not come from weakness. It came from intelligence, from sensitivity, from awareness. You were paying attention. You noticed what created safety. You noticed what created risk. And without realizing it, you adjusted to protect your place in the world. That realization alone can feel disorienting, because it challenges the identity you built around your pain. For years, you may have believed you were the problem. You may have believed you were defective, emotionally limited, disconnected by nature. But what if you were none of those things? What if you were someone who learned how to survive environments that required you to disconnect? That question changes your position completely, because if your numbness was learned, it was never your original state. And if it was never your original state, it cannot be your final state either. This is where self-blame begins to lose its authority. Self-blame depends on the belief that you caused your own disconnection. But you cannot blame yourself for a system that was trying to protect you. You cannot blame yourself for adapting to preserve connection, stability, and safety. You cannot blame yourself for doing what every nervous system is designed to do. Continue. Preserve. Survive. And survival is not a character flaw. It is evidence of strength. Not the loud kind of strength people celebrate, but the quiet kind. The kind that keeps you here even when you feel lost inside yourself. The kind that keeps a part of you watching, waiting, refusing to fully disappear. Because something inside you never agreed with the story that you were broken. Something inside you always knew this wasn't the full truth. You may not have heard it clearly, but you felt it in the moments where the numbness scared you. In the moments where you wondered where you went. In the moments where you questioned whether this was really who you were meant to become. That questioning was not weakness. It was awareness trying to reach you. Awareness trying to show you that your current state was not your identity. It was your adaptation. And adaptation can be understood. Adaptation can be honored. Adaptation can be released, not by force, not by pressure, but by removing the blame that keeps it in place. Because blame locks adaptation into permanence. Understanding allows it to loosen. Understanding tells your nervous system something it has been waiting to hear for years. You are no longer under threat. You are no longer required to disappear to survive. You are no longer required to hold yourself together by suppressing who you are. That message does not immediately change everything, but it changes your direction. Instead of turning against yourself, you begin turning toward yourself. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" you begin asking, "What happened to me?" And that question creates space. Space for compassion. Space for truth. Space for the possibility that you were never the enemy. You were the one who endured. You were the one who adapted. You were the one who stayed. And the moment you truly see that, self-blame no longer makes sense. Because you cannot hate yourself for surviving. You can only begin to understand the cost of it. When self-blame begins to fall away, something unfamiliar takes its place. Not confidence, not happiness, something quieter. Relief. Relief is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply removes a weight you didn't realize you were carrying every moment of your life. For years, you may have lived as if you were responsible for your own disappearance, as if you were the one who abandoned yourself, as if you were the one who failed to remain whole. And that belief shaped everything. It shaped how you saw your past. It shaped how you interpreted your present. It shaped what you believed was possible for your future. Because when you believe you are the problem, hope becomes dangerous. Hope suggests change. Hope suggests possibility. Hope suggests that something inside you could return. But self-blame protects itself by convincing you nothing can. It tells you this is who you are now. Permanent. Fixed. Final. And the longer you believe that, the more distant you feel from yourself. Not because you are gone, but because you stopped allowing yourself to come back. The moment you release self-blame, that barrier weakens. You stop standing in your own way. You stop reinforcing the story that kept you trapped. You stop identifying with the version of yourself that was built only to survive. And you begin to recognize something important. You are not the numbness. You are the one who experienced it. You are not the distance. You are the one who noticed it. You are not the absence. You are the one who remained aware of it. That awareness matters. Because awareness means something inside you never disappeared. Something inside you stayed present enough to witness your own adaptation. Stayed present enough to question it. Stayed present enough to listen to something like this and recognize yourself in it. That part of you was never broken. It was waiting. Waiting for the moment you stopped blaming yourself for protecting your own survival. Waiting for the moment you saw your past with clarity instead of judgment. Waiting for the moment you understood that what you did made sense. Not because it was ideal, but because it was necessary. And when you see yourself through that lens, compassion begins to replace criticism. You begin to see the version of you who adapted not as weak, but as intelligent. Not as defective, but as responsive. Not as lost, but as protective. You begin to see that you were never fighting yourself. You were protecting yourself from something you didn't yet understand. And that understanding changes your relationship with yourself. It creates the possibility of trust. Trust is not built instantly. Trust is built through safety. And safety begins when you stop treating yourself like the enemy. When you stop assuming your reactions are wrong. When you stop assuming your distance means failure. When you stop assuming your numbness defines your identity. Because it never did. It only defined your protection. And protection was never meant to be your permanent state. It was meant to carry you through something, not become who you are forever. There is a difference between surviving and living. Surviving keeps you here. Living allows you to feel here. You have already survived. That part is over. The question now is not whether you were the problem. You were not. The question now is what becomes possible when you stop blaming yourself. Because when blame disappears, something else begins to emerge. Not immediately, not forcefully, but naturally. The ability to see yourself differently. The ability to relate to yourself differently. The ability to exist without constant internal resistance. And that is where everything begins to change. In the next part, you will begin to understand what happens when self-protection is no longer necessary. What happens when your nervous system no longer needs to keep you at a distance. What happens when the version of you that adapted no longer has to carry everything alone? I explain that step in the next video. You'll find it in the description. It may help you understand what it means not just to survive yourself, but to finally return